and have you here. Thank you very much for doing this, and I turn over to you.
Hi, Catherine. Hi, Jan. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting ANCTA to this really exciting session. It's following your explanation and also some questions, and I found it extremely useful and interesting. I went through also the handbook, and this was on the handbook on SPS and TPT was so comprehensive. It really explained very, very well in terms of like, how SPS TPT provision in RTA could ensure proportionality, basically addressing the controlling of the trade restrictiveness of SPS and TPT measures during the pandemic. It also talked about, how this provision could be helpful for ensuring compatibility. And this is really for enhancing imports or trade flows during the emergency. And compatibility, you mentioned the tools like mutual recognition, equivalence, and harmonization. And I really found that handbook really comprehensive and useful. So I really don't need to add anything more on that handbook. So I think I'm going to touch upon sort of the recommend couple of further reads to enhance the understanding of this SPS and TBT measures in the COVID pandemic and how RTA, could actually facilitate the trade flows during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So, Catherine, like you were saying during this, I think it was the question 10 that you were doing, these SPS and TBT agreements actually refer to all these important SDGs, SDG 2, 3, and 12. I think the most important thing is that basically SPS and TBT measures are not trade measures in strict sense, that they're really trying to address these domestic non-trade concerns, in particular health and safety concerns. And that's why these measures are one of those measures that were used most during the pandemic period. And then how we can actually control this trade restrictiveness of such measures, which many countries actually use to protect their health and safety of their population. This is through the regulatory cooperation. Like you said, Catherine, that it's for the compatibility side and through mutual recognition and so on and so forth. And the important point is that the RTAs are really useful providing the frameworks for such regulatory cooperation. And that's why we think that SPS and TBT provisions in the RTA can have a huge potential for facilitating trade flows in health emergencies such as this. And why is it important? Because if so, then we can really cut the time required for facilitating emergency imports of medical supplies or PPEs, or the important thing. And also by facilitating it, we can cut costs associated with the trade and imports, exports of those goods. And so I just want to go into this further reads recommendation. Can you go to the next slide, please? The first one is about this is an UNCTAD study on NTMs and what kind of NTMs were or have been used during the pandemic period. This is a comprehensive assessment of the use and the choice of NTMs that were used by different countries. It's really looked at the very many countries and identified what kind of NTMs, non-tariff measures, were used. And I think for you, there were some questions on some NTMs and so on and so forth. This really provides some good information on, so basically which type of NTMs were applied during the time of the pandemic for 1, trade restrictiveness purposes, and 2, trade enhancing purposes. In this study, especially like figure 2 and table 1 help you to understand that apart from, in terms of the trade facilitation measures, apart from subsidies and so on and so forth, SPS and TBT indeed were the most used measures for trade facilitation. And what do you mean by, used measures? Mean that they actually, countries exempted the application of requirements such as certification requirements, quality control requirements, safety and performance requirements, and so on and so forth, because what mattered was the time, what mattered was how quickly and how much in quantity that they could import these important measures, so they actually exempted these requirements. It was not only SPS TBT per se, but also they exempted the measures that were linked to SPS and TBT, such as pre-shipment inspections and non-automatic import licensing. Okay, so this was good that countries were flexible enough to waiver certain requirements, but this also added a bit of the complication, because when they were doing that as a temporary and emergency measures, it wasn't always clear the time frame and the scope of it. It was emergency measures, so it wasn't really easy to figure out what was going to be the scope of such temporary measures and how long it would be applied to which products. So that was a bit of the confusion that were created by sort of arbitrary exemption of SPS and TBT measures during the COVID period. Can you move to the next slide, please? Then another study that you might find it useful is that these model RTA provisions on SPS and TBT. This was in fact the one that was selected during the policy hackathon on SPS and TBT and later published as UNCTAD studies. This one reviewed these 107 RTAs and systematically assessed to what extent each RTA actually referred to the importance of regulatory cooperation, particularly focusing on mutual recognition, equivalence, and the harmonization. They used a scoring system to see that how enforceable these provisions in each of RTAs were. So what they found was that out of 107, only 17 RTAs had the reference to the importance of the regulatory cooperation, and none of RTAs had provisions on emergency measures or temporary measures. Then they actually went into, of course, provided this RTA, potential provisions in terms of SPS and TBT. I think you find it very useful in this study. But also what I thought it was very important was that they also suggested that, one important thing, probably this is not only for SPS and TBT, but the RTA provisions on emergency measures, they can define what are the situations that we can consider as public health emergency. We can pre-identify the type of products, preferably at HS 6-digit level, that, when the emergency hits, what are the products that we really want to apply emergency measures. And 3, also, RTA can help members to agree on the time frame and sort of the nature of the temporality of such measures. I thought these were extremely useful to prepare the members for that kind of emergency situation. And why is it useful? Because by being prepared, then you can, again, as I mentioned, you can reduce the time required for the emergency imports and exports of the products, and through reducing the complication, you can reduce the cost of trade. So this was, I think you will find all this, the in-depth study on, model RTA provisions on SPS and TBT quite useful. The next please. Also, I just added here the recent report by WTO. And this is about the regulatory cooperation on vaccines, because vaccine imports, vaccine manufacturing is the most urgent issue at this moment. And SPS and TBT, again, are very relevant and useful for this the issue. This report actually talks about, the trade or the sort of the circulation of COVID vaccines, and also the inputs to the COVID vaccines are subject to a lot of SPS and TBT procedures and regulations, and they clearly, they really accept the highlights the importance of bilateral and regional trade agreements to help and simplify these import procedures that that can really influence the flows of the vaccines. They also talked about beyond LTAs, there's a regional cooperation that can really help prepare the ground when the emergency hits, such as this African medicine regulatory harmonization. And also within the ASEAN, there's a harmonized drug registration. So it's about the regional cooperation in the area of pharmaceutical. And already, if we have that kind of regional cooperation ground, then the time required for identifying what kind of requirements, what kind of medicines could be imported, what kind of inputs could be imported within the region could be eliminated, and it really facilitates a very quick reaction to the emergency by facilitating the trade. So these are the 3 recent reports that I'd like to recommend everyone to read as a sort of to enhance the further understanding of the situation, and also if you want to assess further of this very important issue in RTA and also in the COVID emergency control. The next piece. So these studies, the title and the web links are provided here. The third one, in fact, is not exactly the one that I mentioned in the report, mentioned in the previous slide, which is the WTO report on the regulatory cooperation. The third one is also very, very useful, I think. It is a compendium of different statistical information on how COVID-19 impacted world economy and then the society. And this is the compendium provided by the different UN and other international agencies. And I think you'll find it very interesting. And the WTO report, you can go into this WTO regulatory cooperation workshop, and then you can download a series of the reports on these things. If you, as I sort of, early in the morning. I also sent it in the message about the source for the non-tariff measures that UNCTAD, in partnership with WTO and ITC, we provide information and analysis on non-tariff measures. There's also the compendium of the database of different, NTMs of different countries, covering almost 90% of the world trade. You'll find it quite interesting to go and explore the site to further understand the types of NTMs, including SPS and TBT. I hope I managed to do it within the time, but thank you very much.